Hello everyone, this is Ayler Honeycutt, and today I'm going to be going over some ways that we can utilize RaceStudio 3 to accurately determine clutch stall speed. Specifically, in this video, I'm going to be focusing on how we can do this for Purdue Grand Prix karts utilizing the KT100 power plant. Now, a unique challenge of the KT100 power plant is that most of these two-stroke engines will be utilizing a centrifugal clutch. Now, a centrifugal clutch is, like it sounds, simply utilizing the rotational inertia of a set of lever arms in order to compress a set of clutch plates against the output drive. Now, in order to actually decouple the engine from the drive line, there are a set of springs that we can use to adjust the RPM at which this decoupling and coupling action occurs. However, it can be difficult in pit lane and at the track to determine exactly what this speed is set at. And because this speed is absolutely critical for determining our kart power band as well as the overall performance on corner exit, it is extremely beneficial to be able to know exactly where our clutch is stalling at. So, typically you may have heard of methods such as doing clutch pulls in pit lane, whereby you have a driver get on the throttle for about 20 seconds in a straight line, and simply look at the Mychron and observe what the RPM speed stalls out at. That, or you can send a driver out on track and have them take a look at the Mychron when they are on corner exit in order to try and see where that stall speed is occurring. However, both of these methods require having the driver be actively engaged in staring at a screen while they're also trying to navigate a kart around a potentially busy track. And this is obviously a method that is subject to some level of human error. So, what are some ways that we can instead become more consistent with this determination? Well, luckily, the Mychron records all of these RPM point data, and we can load it directly into RaceStudio 3 in order to see a plotted chart of this data across a single or multiple laps. Now, a really simple way, especially if you're just trying to get a quick idea for where your clutch engagement is sitting, is to pull up the time distance plot and select your RPM and GPS speeds and plot them versus the distance or time of the lap. Specifically, the distance plot is going to allow us to see where on track something occurred, rather than just when. The advantage to this is it allows us to compare multiple different laps that may have been vastly different lap times, while still being able to overlay exactly where this happened on track for both. So, in this case, some of you might be able to already see an easy way to get an idea for what our clutch and stall speed is going to be is simply taking the RPM trace data and finding a spot where it plateaus or where it doesn't look like it is increasing at a very fast rate. What this is going to tell us is normally this is followed by a period or a break period where we got off the throttle and have transitioning back onto the throttle. So the engine has been decoupled and is rotating independently of our rear tires, and now the clutch is being slipped against that output. And as we can see here, our GPS speed is increasing while our engine RPM is staying constant. And given the common setup for a KT100 is a single fixed gear ratio, we know that any time that our RPM and our GPS speed are not linearly related in a 1-to-1 ratio, that there is some level of slip that must be occurring in the driveline. So, by simply hovering cursor over this section of the RPM trace and watching in the upper right corner or upper left, depending on what side of the graph we're on, we can observe that this clutch in this instance was engaging at around 11,000 RPM. Now, this is great if you have very clear data, and this is a relatively good example here. However, there are times, like in this previous corner, there may be things happening to the cart that are going to affect these readings and induce noise, such as bouncing, hopping, jerky steering inputs, or whatnot. And this can make it difficult to pinpoint exactly what this engagement or stall RPM is set to. As you can see here, we have a range of possible values that this is being indicating for our stall speed, and it's not entirely clear from first glance what this is actually set to. And when we are making very, very small adjustments on our clutch stall speed, such as 50 to 100 RPM, this level of uncertainty isn't all that desirable. So, there are luckily some other ways that we can utilize the data that is recorded by default by your Mychron in order to get a better, more accurate picture of what this actual true value is. So to do that, I have created a custom clutch layouts panel. And what this is going to do is simply give us a couple of different metrics by which to make a better, more accurate understanding of what we are looking at in the data. The first of these is going to be the clutch slippage channel, and this is a custom math function that I developed. And so we're going to go ahead and clear the coloring of this. We'll come back to that in a moment. But what the clutch slippage channel is essentially telling us is it is quantifying the ratio at which the RPM and GPS speed are diverging at every single measurement point in the lap. So for every single measurement of RPM, it is going to compare the RPM to GPS speed ratio. And regardless of what your gear ratio is set to on the rear gear, this is going to give you a somewhat consistent measurement of the one-to-one locking of your clutch. And anytime that, as we talked about, this is diverging, it will indicate as a increased clutch slip percentage. Now, it's important to note that for this channel, the actual numeric values for clutch slip don't necessarily mean anything. They are simply a scalar quantity that we are using to compare and reference different points and measurement points to one another. So, anytime that we observe data not following a linear trend as RPM increases on the x-axis, then we know that there is some level of slip occurring in this region of our graph. So we can utilize this, and then by simply investigating the data here, we can see that by and large, if we click on the majority of these points clustered in this area, we can observe that this agrees with our previous assertion when we were looking at our RPM data, that we have an engagement speed of about 11,000 RPM. So this is a great way if you have some noisy data, such as here, that will statistically cluster all of these points for you around a specific area and make it a little bit more clear what is happening. If you don't want to use a custom math channel, you can also simply plot your GPS speed versus RPM. And in much the same way as our clutch slip channel, this will give you very similar information. As you can see here, as our RPM increases in the upper levels, there is a linear relationship between the GPS speed and RPM. However, when we get near what we think is our clutch stall speed, we notice that this relationship transitions into a non-linear one, until eventually we find a lower bound, as described here, or a asymptote. And so what this is going to tell us is that we know that the lower bound for what our clutch engagement is set to is likely falls along this line. And the engagement range that we are experiencing is going to be bounded by this cluster of points. And so, much the same way that we took and clicked on the individual points in the clutch slippage, we can do the exact same thing for this graph. And we can see that this also agrees largely with what we were observing in the trace data here, that we have an engagement speed of around 11,000 RPM, with some level of variability to it. Finally, if we want to make doubly sure that we have a good picture of where the actual engagement is occurring, we can utilize our longitudinal acceleration channel, which is describing basically how much acceleration the cart is experiencing when we were getting on throttle, and plot this value against RPM. And so what this is going to show us is very much similar to these two previous channels. It is going to indicate a large degree of clustering, at least at the Purdue Grand Prix track, right around the RPM values that our clutch engagement is set to. And as you can see, this trails off from there. Another interesting thing to note about this graph specifically is this is going to be analogous to a dyno chart. So all this is basically is a glorified torque versus RPM trace. And using this, as long as we are comparing directly between the same cart on the same day with the same driver, we can make a relatively confident inference that this is going to be the effective power band of our cart when compared to previous data. Now, if we wanted to make a direct comparison, say with another cart or another driver that has a different front profile or running a different engine build, we would have to do a bit more math in order to account for things like air resistance, rolling resistance of the tires, gear ratios, and overall vehicle mass. However, for a cursory glance, if you're always comparing with relatively similar vehicles that don't change in the setup weight as much, this is a great way to make sure that your carburation settings and or tuning settings are having an impact on your engine performance. So, what we've been able to determine so far is that by utilizing these scatter plots here, we can say that, okay, we are pretty confident that our engagement stall speed is set to around 11,000 RPM. However, as we noted here, there is a little bit of uncertainty. There is a clustering. What if these values are actually truly values that we care about or are valid measurements for our clutch slippage? And how many of these are just noise? Well, one way that we can narrow this down just visually without having to do a lot of complicated filtering and or math is to add a third dimension to our plots. And we can do this by coming up to the color channels icon, choosing a color channel, and in this case I'm going to select the longitudinal acceleration positive channel. And what this is going to do is it's simply going to color each individual data point proportionally according to what the observed longitudinal acceleration value was at that corresponding point, with red being a higher value of longitudinal acceleration and blue being a lower value of longitudinal acceleration. And so the reason this is helpful for us is we know when we are engaging in clutch slip, at least for the periods of time that we care about, that the cart is undergoing peak acceleration. We are trying to tune our clutch to engage right around where the peak torque, or right before the peak torque is occurring in the cart. So, by utilizing this color channel, we can now see that the demarcation of where this crossover is occurring is a bit narrower, or a bit more clear in terms of where the relationship is. Previously, we had groups and clusters of data that we weren't sure if these were valid observations or were simply noise. But by utilizing this color channel, we can see that these measurements that previously we had no way of separating in terms of their validity from the rest of the data do in fact lie outside of what our specific criteria are for analyzing clutch slip, because we don't necessarily care when the cart is decelerating and is still locked. So, by utilizing this, we can get an even more refined picture and be more confident in choosing a range of values for our clutch engagement RPM. And this is especially helpful beyond such as we are lucky in this case that the data is relatively clear and relatively clean. However, there are times and even certain tracks where it will make utilizing these methods more complicated. And so being able to have a variety of tools at our disposal that help us narrow the effective range with which we can determine this is going to be incredibly helpful and improve the quality of our analysis.